Приветствуем вас сегодня в эфире у Апострофа. Очень интересный гость, британский политик Брукс Ньюмарк. Сегодня мы поговорим не только о британской политике, о том, выйдет ли все-таки Британия из Брексита, но и о украинской политике, а также о взаимоотношениях между Великобританией и Украиной. So, hello, welcome in Ukraine. How are you? So let's start from questions about Ukraine. It's very interesting. What was your first impression when you found out about the election results in Ukraine, that Mr. Zelensky become a president? And what do you think? Do you believe that not professional politic can be really very effectively a president in a country like Ukraine with a lot of problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happened in Ukraine is part of a broader trend throughout Europe and in the rest of the world. We have seen in the European elections, for example, the more populist parties doing increasingly well at the cost of the establishment parties. And so the evidence would seem to be that rather than complaining when outsiders do well in politics, is to understand why ordinary people are disillusioned with the establishment parties. There's no point in the establishment parties, business, the media, complaining that we can't have this result. We don't like this result, because you insult the intelligence of the people that voted for them. It's far better that the establishment understand why it is in the UK the Brexit party under Nigel Farage does well, why Salvini in Italy does well, why Le Pen in France does well, why Donald Trump in the US does well. I mean, to sort of say it's an aberration, I think the evidence would be to the contrary. Increasingly populist parties are doing well because ordinary people feel there is a disconnect between the establishment politicians and the way they lead their lives.
Could you say that people elect actors and other media people like that because they get disappointed with establishment parties?
They do, but there must be something that the actors or whoever they may be are saying that appeals to people. I mean, don't forget, one of America's greatest presidents, Ronald Reagan, was an actor.
But
Yes, you're right. He was governor of California, which is a very good point. But people, when he became president, said, "Oh, he's a B-rate actor." So I think it's always worth giving somebody the chance. We're lucky that we live in a democracy. You may say democracy is a little less perfect in some places than others, but we do live in a democracy. When you elect somebody, you give them a chance to deliver on what they say. If you don't like what they say, and if they don't do what they say they're going to do, then at the next election you have an opportunity to get rid of them. That is why democracy, I think, is a good thing.
Can you imagine the same situation in Great Britain? Because I think Great Britain is very conservative, and I can believe that people, British people, can vote for a comedian, for actress, or maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think it's different because the way your system is structured, the way the US is structured politically, is you have a separate vote for the executive versus the legislative. So in the UK, first you have to be elected a member of parliament, then you're part of a party group, and that party then elects the leader. So there's a Latin expression which is primus inter pares, which means first among equals. So the leader of my party is primus inter pares. He or she is first among equals. We are all equal in that we're all members of parliament, but this person is elected as the number one. Over here and in the United States, for example, you have a separate vote for the president than from the MPs. So there's a much greater connection between the members of parliament in the UK and their leader.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that Ukraine's new president, Volodymyr Zelensky, will be able to establish an even better relationship with the European Union? And generally, what perspectives do you see for Ukraine with the European Union and NATO?
Well, as a country, you're sort of split as to those that want a closer relationship with Europe versus a segment of your population which are ethnically Russian speakers who have a different view on that. I would argue that you live in a democracy and the majority should prevail. And if the majority wish to have a closer relationship with the EU or NATO, you are entitled to do that because you're a sovereign nation. What I find that I don't like is interference from a foreign power, in this case Russia, who thinks that they can try and influence what is going on nationally. To the extent that they arm Russian speakers in this country, they have up to 2,000 of their own soldiers in your Eastern Front. They have GRU, FSB, maybe 200 or 300 of them. And so they have a bad influence on what's going on. They refuse to let democracy play out. And I think that's one of the great challenges your president faces, is that you have much more instability than we do in Europe and the UK. Now, can he pull it off? I don't know. But clearly, with 70-ish% of the vote, and I suspect when the members of parliament are elected, he will also get a large percentage of that, that clearly the people are saying, let's give him a chance. If he fails to deliver, to hopefully bring peace within your country, improve the economic lot of people outside of the capital here, the poor people who have not done as well economically as people here in the capital. If he fails to deliver on that, in all likelihood, he will get defeated at the next election.
Yes, we're talking about Russia, and I have one question about the mechanism. What mechanism do you see between this conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Because we have a few points how to stop it. One point is that we should talk with Russia face by face. Zelensky should talk with Putin without any countries. And other points that we should talk with other countries, for example, Germany, France. What is the best way to stop the war?
Well, there was a US Secretary of State called Warren Christopher who said diplomacy becomes a little lazy if all we do is talk to your friends. So you or I or the president may not like Mr. Putin, but in diplomacy it's important that you engage with people and you talk to them. So I think he's absolutely right to try to engage with him. But I think in terms of him making any headway with him, I think is unlikely because he's a much weaker partner. Ukraine is a much weaker partner in those discussions versus Russia. So I do think it's important that the Europeans, NATO, the US in particular, gets engaged in this to support the Ukrainians. Because I think without a strong partner, Ukraine is unlikely to have a balanced negotiation, and nor is Putin likely to take Ukraine seriously. Unless there is stick and carrot, as the expression is, it's unlikely an individual who believes that brute force is the solution to problems that you will make much headway.
Yeah. Speaking about the United States, the relationship between Russia and the United States is very crucial for Ukraine. How do you see that dynamic going, and will they come to agreement regarding Ukraine, or how do you see the United States position?
Well, there's a number of dynamics going on. So there are three different areas globally where the Americans perhaps and the Russians are coming head to head. First, if you want to look locally, there's Ukraine and the illegal acquisition of Crimea by Russia. Secondly, there's Syria and what's going on there in the Middle East, and the fact that Russia has been an accelerant to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians there. And the third area is South America with Venezuela and Maduro. So there are three areas in the world where the Americans and the Russians have different interests. And I think when negotiations, discussions start, it's not just, I don't think, Ukraine in isolation. It's what's going on in each of those areas with respect to Russia and what they're up to.
I went back to topic of I just remember that Mr. Zelensky have opinion that we should have a referendum about questions what we should do with Russian. Do we need some negotiation, or maybe, so he wants to know what Ukrainians thinking about it. So, and I remember that Great Britain is good example in these questions of referendum. What do you think? Do we need referendum? Is it good way to vote on important political issues? And yes, that's all.
I think referendum are good with key important constitutional issues, but a decision to engage and talk to somebody shouldn't necessarily be put to a referendum, because people tend to vote much more emotionally, how they feel at a particular time. Part of the reason of electing a president is that you expect some form of leadership. And leadership means sometimes doing things that are not necessarily always popular. So if the president believes that it is in the national interest to engage with Russia, he should go ahead and do that. He shouldn't need to ask the people's permission to do that. So, you know, I would hope that with the foreign policy advisors around him, he can begin at least a dialogue. But I don't believe that dialogue should necessarily be in isolation. As I said, I think it's important that if he wants to go in with some strength in those discussions, he should have the Europeans and the Americans certainly covering his back.
Doesn't it look like the president would just be putting the responsibility on people instead of himself?
Yes, I would say that, yes. I think if he uses referendum as a way of making up his own mind on things, that's called followership, not leadership. And if he wants to be a leader, he has to make tough decisions that he thinks is in the best interest of the country. As I said, I think referendum are important for constitutional issues, but not on day-to-day policy issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And moving a bit to the Great Britain, with Theresa May's resignation, there are currently 10 candidates for the Prime Minister's position. How would you evaluate Boris Johnson's chances?
I would say fairly high. I think that the worse that Theresa May did in the polls, the more MPs worry about their seats. So it goes back to the beginning of our discussion of who's a populist, who is attractive to the most amount of people. And in my party, there are many smart, qualified candidates. But the question is, who can beat Corbyn, who is the leader of the Labour Party, so our opposition in the UK? And in my view, probably, and I think in many other MPs' view, Boris Johnson, you know, is the strongest candidate to take on Jeremy Corbyn in a leadership election. But you have to remember that the way the leadership works is chosen in the UK. It's two stages. The first stage is to narrow the field down from, I think there are 12 candidates today, down to 2 candidates. And those final 2 candidates go out to the membership of the Conservative Party, so ordinary people who are not MPs, but members of the Conservative Party, of which there are about 140,000 in the country today. They will choose who is the next leader and therefore the Prime Minister. Now, the politics of the grassroots is much more pro-Brexit than the MPs. So I think that even if the MPs push at least one Remain candidate, who's likely to get through, I suspect the other person will be a Brexit candidate. And that could well be Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab or possibly Michael Gove. But whoever is in the final 2, the most pro-Brexit candidate, I think, will win.
There's also an opinion that the party might delay the decision on their candidate in order to delay the Brexit decision. and that would lead to general elections. Do you think this scenario is at all possible? And
there's an expression, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And I don't think any of the MPs today in either party particularly want a general election, because as we saw in the European elections, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party did very badly.
If Boris Johnson becomes the Prime Minister, how do you see the development of Brexit?
He has said that he will deliver Brexit by the end of October. So if he makes a statement and a promise like that, he either delivers on it or his fate will be the same as Theresa May's.
And how he can do it by October, because it's not too much time.
That's right. So there's a possibility that if we cannot make the changes that we want to in what's called the withdrawal agreement, where we leave both the customs union and the single market, which is what Brexit is, you can't fudge that. And that's what Theresa May has tried to do, that's what Jeremy Corbyn has tried to do, and they paid a heavy price for that in the elections. You either have to decide, I am going to remain, I want to remain, that's where I'm going to take my party, or I'm going to leave. So I am hoping that if we say we're going to leave, we either have a deal by 31st of October, which is acceptable to the majority of Parliament, or we leave without a deal. Now, leaving without a deal doesn't necessarily mean we have no deal. It just means our negotiating position is different. If I say to you in a negotiation, I won't leave the table without a deal, you know you have leverage over me. And that has been the weakness, I think, of the government's position. If you're not prepared to walk away from a table in a negotiation, you are vulnerable. And I think the next leader must be prepared to walk away from the table, say we're leaving, and then once we've left, the chances are we will have an agreement, because the EU needs to trade with us. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. German manufacturing needs to sell their Mercedes and Audis and Porsches to the UK. I think they sell 20% of their high-end cars to the UK. French farmers need to sell their goods to the UK. So I don't think there'll be no deal forever. It just means that we'll just have a different deal.
And Theresa May also had a rather strict policies regarding Russia, and she supported sanctions against Russian oligarchs. If Boris Johnson is elected, will he continue the same policy, or what could Ukraine expect?
Well, I think that hopefully, and I don't know, I'm hoping that Boris Johnson, if he was Foreign Secretary, was privy to information that showed that, unfortunately, and I say this unfortunately, that Russia has become a much bigger threat to the West than they used to be. And that is a function of the paranoid dysfunctionality of President Putin. Putin just thinks everybody is out to get him, and therefore behaves in a way where he ends up hurting other people. Now, I suspect we will retain and remain having a fairly robust policy against not the Russian people, the Russian government, and we should make a distinction there. That none of us have any problem with the Russian people. It is their government who I think we have a problem with. And you can't go around assassinating people, as Putin has done, on UK sovereign territory, using very strong weaponized chemicals to kill people. And in the case of Skripal's and Novichok, which I'm sure your listeners and readers will know about, where he sent over some assassins to kill somebody who had been a Russian citizen who settled in the UK by bringing a weapons-grade chemical into the UK and using it to try and kill 2 people. And, that to us was beyond the pale, and not an amount of dissembling or anything else. When you have weapons-grade chemicals, like he was using, they can only come from certain laboratories. So think of it as like fingerprints. When you use something as strong as that, you know exactly where it was made. Nobody can really replicate your fingerprints or my fingerprints. They are ours, they're unique. And so it was quite easy to trace it back. The second problem for, I think, the Russians was that we have a lot of CCTV in the UK. And I think his people could see very clearly who these people were because they were caught on CCTV, and through facial recognition, our intelligence services were able to identify exactly who these people were, where they came from, and so on. So it made it very hard, I think, at the end of the day, for Russia to defend the indefensible.
And what kind of support Ukraine could hope for from Great Britain? How do you think?
Well, if I get engaged again politically, whoever the next leader is, hopefully a lot strongly. I think that you will find that in the UK Parliament in particular, that the vast majority of MPs are hugely sympathetic to the Ukrainian people. There are very, very few what I would call Russian sympathizers.
One question about Russian sanction. Do you really believe that this European sanction, USA sanction, have influence to Russian economics?
They have an influence, but they can be stronger in my view.
It's not enough.
It's not enough because the bad behavior of Putin continues until it is extremely painful. Not just for the Russian people. The problem is with these very wealthy oligarchs is, of course, they have lots of money. But, which is why when I was an MP, I said we shouldn't necessarily be targeting the Russian people. I said we should be targeting the oligarchs. We should be targeting their bank accounts. We should be restricting their travel, certainly into the EU and the UK and the USA. We should stop their wives shopping at our high-end stores. We should stop their children being educated in our countries. The more pressure we put on the people around Putin, it's more likely to lead to a change in his behavior than simply economic sanctions, which just hurt ordinary Russians, not Putin and not the people around him.
I read in media one point that the European business is really very angry because they don't like sanction and they have bad impact European business of this Russian sanction, and a lot of them want to have good relationship with Russia. Is it true?
Yeah, I think there are. I think you particularly see sort of French and German companies that are like that. You see that with Iran as well. But unless you know, there are two ways we can go about it. There's war, but nobody wants to go to war. So therefore, the other tool that we have at our disposal is economic and diplomatic sanctions. I much prefer to use economic sanctions than using military solutions to problems. And we have a lot of power to do that. And we've seen an impact both, for example, where there have been effective sanctions in Russia and in Iran to change their behavior in the past. It's just that we've slightly taken our foot off the throat of both, which has led to them suddenly reverting back to their bad behavior.
Why do many Europeans invest in Russian companies instead of Ukrainian ones? And why is it kind of on a quiet scale that Ukraine could be a good partner as well?
Because Russia is a bigger country. They have more economic power, and therefore, particularly in the energy sector. So people want to take advantage of that. I don't necessarily think it's the right thing to do. And I think that if we want a good partnership with Ukraine, we should be doing more to support Ukraine both militarily as well as economically. And economically means supporting business. And so I guess I would agree with the thrust of your question. I think that again, if we start doing business with Russians, it sends a very bad signal that we think they're actually okay. But the problem is in Russia today, there's effectively 500, in a very broad sense, key business people, oligarchs. And, you know, it is a combination of a mafia gangster state. And when you're doing business with gangsters and the mafia, generally at the end of the day, there's only one person that wins.
And in particular, if Boris Johnson is elected, how do you see the development of the relationship between Great Britain and Russia?
You know, as I said, I think if Boris Johnson is elected, Boris Johnson was in the Foreign Office and therefore will be privy to the behavior of the Russians. So I think he'll tread very carefully. Notwithstanding that, if we go back to the beginning of my conversation, I do think, though, it is important that we do engage in dialogue with Putin. Because you never want to get into a situation where someone says, well, no one's actually spoken to me. No one has tried to speak to me. So it's very important that we always try our best through dialogue. If dialogue does not work, then we use other means.
And very important questions to all Ukrainians people. Currently, Ukraine has a free visa with with European Union countries, except for Great Britain. Do you see any potential possibility of having a visa-free regime between two countries, or maybe you have point how to make it easier? Because now it's really very hard to take even a touristic visa.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of countries, it's not just Ukraine, there's a lot of countries that are finding this. I think because one of the touchstone issues in the public dialogue has been immigration, that the Home Office has tightened up in a lot of areas. And I think it has impacted our economy in a negative way. I would much prefer us to be a little easier with tourist visas, but to be stricter on the penalties that if people overstay their visas. And the big worry is that people tend to use tourist visas to find another way to more permanently settle in the UK and then try and get work. And I understand that because in the UK we have like 2.5% unemployment today. So we have incredibly low unemployment, very high employment, so we need people. But I think we have need an improved system in deciding who comes in and doesn't come into our country.
And the last question is that it is often heard in the media that Europe is kind of tired already of Ukraine and the Ukrainian topic. Could you confirm this? Or
No, I think that there have been other issues that have been emerging more on the domestic agendas of all European countries, and that is the challenge of populist parties. So if you're a mainstream party, you're always looking over your shoulder at what's going on domestically. So it's not that people are getting tired of Ukraine, it's just that a bigger pressure point in politicians' lives domestically is the domestic political scene, and I think that's what it is.
Thank you very much for such interesting conversation. Брукс Ньюмарк был нашим гостем. Спасибо, что смотрели нас. Оставляйте свои комментарии. Не забывайте подписываться на наш YouTube-канал.